certain that Germany's only chance of defeating Britain was to cut the Atlantic lifeline to America. He held firmly to this concept throughout the war, and I believe that he was right. Consequently, to Dönitz, Hitler's orders to station U-boats off Gibraltar, in the Mediterranean, off West Africa, in the Indian Ocean, and even off Norway, where they aimed to stop supplies from reaching Russia, were unimportant sidelines which gravely jeopardized the main object. If he had had his way, every U-boat would have been in the North Atlantic. So I chose a routine trade convoy in the North Atlantic, sailing from the United States and Canada to Britain at a time, in late March 1943, when the Battle of the Atlantic had reached a turning point. The story of convoy HX231 has all the ingredients of a typical oceanic confrontation. It was a large convoy, one of the first with over 60 ships. It had only a small surface escort, and the operations around it took place before the defence had secured the advantage over the attack, which came later. It was almost the first convoy to receive effective long-range air escort from the liberators based in Iceland and Northern Ireland. A pack of 21 U-boats was directed onto the convoy, of which 18 gained contact and 17 started an attack. The convoy lost 3 ships which were torpedoed while in its columns, and another 3 ships which had broken out or become involuntary stragglers were sunk separately, well clear of the convoy. The story of the survivors is indeed dramatic and heartrending. There was no special rescue ship to pick up the men from the sunken ships, and the escorts had to try to save them themselves. The weather was bad, or very bad, throughout the passage. Finally, the convoy was one of the first to have help later from one of the newly formed support groups. These roamed the Atlantic, ready to bring aid to convoys which were threatened or attacked. I also chose convoy HX231 selfishly because I was the escort commander and because I wanted to find out what really happened. I have been careful to write the narrative impersonally and, I trust, objectively, and I have been as ready to attribute blame as praise to my performance. Finally, the 6 weeks which followed the arrival in harbour of convoy HX231 saw one of the most dramatic turns of fortune in the whole history of warfare. So I have tried to describe how the situation changed from one in which despair gripped Whitehall to one in which victory had been gained, and the U-boats, if only temporarily, had been withdrawn from the North Atlantic. The chapter which follows will describe part of a typical attack on an ocean convoy by night, and will introduce the listener to the human problems of life in a convoy escort and in the merchant ships under its protection. 1. The Blooding. It was about 2 hours after sunset on Sunday the 4th of April. With a strong northwest wind on its port bow, the convoy was pounding northwards through a rough sea. For the men in all the ships and escorts, the tension was acute. The appalling March toll of Allied merchant vessels exacted by the German U-boat wolf packs meant that the Battle of the Atlantic was now reaching what might well be a fatal climax. There were 61 ships in the convoy, which was very large by the standards of the day, and all were heavily laden. 22 were oil tankers, and the remaining freighters were loaded with a variety of cargoes, ranging from bulk wheat and iron ore to tanks and aircraft. The sinister entry, explosives, appeared on the cargo manifest of several of the vessels, providing an additional terrifying hazard in the case of torpedo attack. The true value of the convoy and its cargo to a beleaguered Britain was beyond price. Of the ships themselves, there was rich variety. Some were large and ponderous freighters, which punched their way through the waves, creaking and groaning as they steamed on, and there were smaller ships, much livelier in movement, shuddering and shaking as they hit the troughs in the heavy sea. All were painted a uniform grey.